Okay, we're going to jump right back in with the heart. And if you have not done so yet, make sure you watch the first video of this lecture on the external anatomy of the heart. We talked about the membranes surrounding the heart, and we talked about the layers of the wall of the heart. And now we're going to go inside the heart because that's where all the magic happens, right? The whole point of this thing is it's a hollow organ which pumps blood. So now we got to talk about how it does that. So if you take a look here, this diagram shows you the internal anatomy of the heart, and we're going to run through that. So when you think about the heart, it's really two separate pumps side by side. So if you went back and if you haven't done so, you might want to watch that lecture I put up on the evolution of the cardiovascular system. But there are three kinds of hearts you can have. There's a two-chambered heart, a three-chambered heart, and a four-chambered heart. We have a four-chambered heart, which is really two-chambered hearts side by side. So we have one side over here, which now this is what gets confusing because as I'm swirling around this mouse like this, what I'm actually doing, even though it's on the left side, when you're of your body, this is actually the right side of the heart because it's looking at you. So if this was in a person which is facing you, this would be that person's left side over here, and this would be the person's right side over here as they're facing you. So see, I just even messed that up. This would be the person's right side. This would be the left side over here. So this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. So the two sides of the heart are separated from each other by something called a septum. So this very thick muscular wall separates the two sides. And as I mentioned before in the evolution of the heart lecture, there are some times where people are born, babies are born, and there's a hole in their heart. If you've ever heard that term before, a hole in the heart, there's the separation, the septum wall here did not fully form, and now there's an opening between these two sides, and that is not good. That causes a bunch of problems. For one thing, it causes the blood to mix, so you have oxygenated and deoxygenated blood mixing, which decreases the overall oxygen content of a person's blood, and also it'll decrease the amount of pressure of the force of the heart pushing outwards, because as you open this up, now you've just increased the volume of the heart, which decreases pressure. So all in all, that is a problem. Luckily, they can solve it. They can do surgery and they can fix it. But that is what happens when a child is born and they have an incomplete septum. So when you look at the heart, it's got two separate pumps side by side, and each one of those two-chambered pumps have two parts to it. So the top part here is called the atrium, or the atria, if we're talking about more than one, and this bottom part here is called the ventricle. So the ventricles are down here, the atria are up here. Now, if you have ever walked into a building before, you walk, sometimes there's like a little kind of foyer or a little entranceway. Like in our school, for example, when you open the first set of doors, there's that little area, and then there's a second set of doors. That little area is called an atrium. It's the entrance to a building. Sometimes it's got a little room that is kind of like the entrance to a building. Well, that is essentially why this is called an atria. This is the entranceway to the heart. So blood comes in from the body through the, up here is called the superior vena cava or cava, depending on I say cava, and then this is the inferior vena cava from down here, which is the bottom of the body. Both of those are going to dump blood into what is called the atria or atrium. It is a thin muscular wall because the only place that this has to push blood to is the right next door into the ventricle. So these walls of the atria are actually very thin. The ventricles, however, have a very thick wall, and that is because they have to push blood out of the heart. So this would be what is called the right ventricle. So this is the right atria, and this is the right ventricle. This is the left atria, and this is the left ventricle. And we're going to talk more about those as we go through, but just make sure you know that terminology. A over V, atria, ventricle. So, the atria and the ventricles are actually separated by these things called valves. So we're going to focus on valves for a little bit. This is a part of the heart that a lot of times gets damaged. It's pretty common that people have to get their valves replaced. You may have a family member that has a valve replacement, and it's actually pretty cool how they do it. At this point, we're at a point where with tissue generation, we're actually 3D printing tissues, they're going to start being able to use human valves. But as of right now, there's really two options for replacing your valves. They use mechanical, like fake ones, plastic, or I'm not actually even sure what material they use, but it is a synthetic valve, or they actually use pig valves because that's the heart we'd be dissecting if we were in school. We dissect pig hearts because they're pretty much identical to human hearts, and the valves can be interchangeable. So we have two sets of valves. We have a set of valves here between the atria and the ventricle, and they're extremely important. They are called the AV valves, which we'll talk about. And on the right side here, this is called the tricuspid valve. So this would be the tricuspid valve. And on the left side, we have the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. Now, you might be saying to yourself, Mr. Adolf, let me pull this down a little bit because you can't even probably see him down here. Why do you have a picture of the Pope down there? Why, is this something to do with religion? The answer to that question is no, it has nothing to do with religion. This type of hat, this Pope hat, is called a mitral hat. And the mitral valve was named that because when they first identified it, whoever did that thought it looked like that type of hat, so they called it a mitral valve. But basically, a tricuspid valve has three little parts to it. That's why the word tri comes in. And then the bicuspid is just two flaps, and when they go together, they look somewhat like a mitral hat. So when you look at the heart, the right side of the heart is getting deoxygenated blood from the body. So this is blood that has been used already. So the blood travels through our systemic system, and that the oxygen is dropped off at the cells, and the carbon dioxide is picked up by the blood, and then that blood comes back into the right side of the heart to get pumped to the lungs. And when it goes to the lungs, it picks up oxygen and drops off carbon dioxide. So that's why this side of the heart is often colored blue. That's the universal, color for deoxygenated blood. So if it doesn't have oxygen, they always are going to color it blue in a diagram. So that's going to be our deoxygenated blood coming in the right side, getting pumped to the lungs. It travels through the lungs and then now has picked up oxygen, and it's going to come into the left side of the heart where it goes into the left atria, left ventricle, and then it pumps out to the body where it's going to drop off that oxygen and pick up more carbon dioxide. So just know that there's two sides to the heart. The right side is always going to be deoxygenated blood, and then the left side is always going to be oxygenated blood. Let's talk a little more about heart valves. Okay, so there's two types of heart valves. The first type are called the AV valves, or the atrioventricular valve, and they're called that because they exist between the atria and the ventricle. So that is going to be our tricuspid and our bicuspid. So this is our tricuspid valve over here. This is our bicuspid valve over here. And what it does is it prevents backflow of blood going the wrong direction, essentially. Blood has to go one direction. This is a one-way scenario. If blood starts backing up the wrong direction, it's going to stop blood flow. And if it does that for long enough, it's going to cause death, because if there's no blood flow, there's no oxygen getting to the cells, there's no cell respiration going on, and then those cells are going to stop producing ATP, and that cell is going to die. So obviously we need some way to make that not happen, and that is where our valves come in. The second set of valves are called the semilunar valves, or the SL valves, and they're located in these two blood vessels here. This is called your pulmonary artery, and that pulmonary artery, anytime you see pulmonary anywhere, that means lungs, okay? So if you heard of someone having a pulmonary embolism, that means they had a blood clot in their lungs. An embolism is a blood clot. So this is a pulmonary artery, so this is called the pulmonary valve. And then this blood vessel over here is called the aorta, and the aorta is the very gigantic blood vessel leaving the heart, and that's all of the blood that is oxygenated going out to your body. This is called the aortic valve. They are called semilunar because, like the mitral valve, they only have two flaps, and whoever identified those thought they looked like a partial moon, like a semilunar. Lunar means moon, like a half moon. So we have our AV valves down here, atrioventricular. This is going to be our tricuspid and our bicuspid. And then these two here are going to be our semilunar valves. This is the pulmonary valve preventing blood flow going back into the heart, going out to the lungs. And this is the aortic valve, preventing blood flow going back into the ventricle before it goes out to the body. And the last thing I want to say about the valves is the AV valve. So we're talking about the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. They have some specialized equipment that allows them to prevent backflow. So as blood gets pumped into the ventricle from the atria. So this is the atria here, this is the ventricle. Blood flow is going to be traveling in this direction. And then when the ventricle contracts, the blood's going to leave the ventricle and go out to the lungs. Well, here's the problem with that. When this ventricle contracts, it's going to push blood this direction, but it's also going to push blood this direction, right? It's going to push it all directions because it's squeezing and pushing blood every which way. So nature had to come up with a way to prevent backflow, because if these valves just, think of an old western. If you've ever seen an old western, when the cowboy goes into the bar, he swings open those saloon doors and they swing back and forth, right? That would not work with the heart, because if those doors swung back and forth, if the blood pushed back this direction when this ventricle contracted, it would cause the blood to flow back into the atria, stopping blood flow and killing the person. So we have two structures which allow that to not happen. The first is called the papillary muscle. There's these little muscles that stick up and they act as basically a base for the second structure I'm going to talk about to attach to. And the second structure are called chordae tendineae. And you can see them better in this picture here. Chordae tendineae are ridiculously strong. They are tough connective fibers. Again, I wish we were in class. I wish we could dissect the heart, because one of my favorite things to show students is to show them how strong these fibers are. I'll always get the biggest person in class, the strongest person, to try to rip them, and they are near impossible to rip with just bare hands. You got to cut them, and they're really strong. And what that does is blood can flow one direction because there's nothing up top. So as the blood flows in, that's no problem. But when the blood tries to go out the other direction, these cords prevent those doors from going the wrong direction. So the chordae tendineae actually hold those doors. I'm calling them doors, but you know, they're really valves, right? So it keeps those valves from causing backflow of blood. So when the heart contracts, the blood can't go the wrong direction. Now we don't have them in the semilunar valves because this part of the heart doesn't pump. So there's nothing pushing blood this direction. So we only need them here and here. We don't need them here and here. And the heart does what the heart wants, as they say, right? The heart doesn't need those valves, so we don't have them. I'm going to go through blood flow of the heart on another video. All right, guys, thank you.